Okay, sorry about the delay there. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about defining tags and types in Lasso 9. This next slide looks a little unfinished, but I'm going to start by talking about syntax evolution. I mean, we just saw from Kyle some of the ways that Lasso 9 has evolved. But Lasso syntax, Lasso of course started as, it was originally conceived as a kind of markup language with programming capabilities. And it's really, over the last decade, changed into a full-featured programming language. However, one thing I always like to emphasize is that the simplicity of the original language is still very much a part of the language. And so we tend to show code samples. You know, we write Lasso every day, and we are always excited about the new features. And so we tend to use as much of the new as we can. But there's really nothing wrong with using kind of older styles of syntax, and they work just fine in the latest version. So I'm just going to run through a quick sample just showing kind of how the language has changed. I think this is maybe, I don't know, this is probably work fine in Lasso 5 at least. I was going to do a Lasso 3 example, but it just became too much of a headache. When was iterate? 7. I get, yeah, my memory is imperfect when we added things. Anyway, so this is the Lasso 7 syntax. But yeah, so this is a simple example. We create an array and then we iterate through the array. We're going to output alpha, beta, gamma with breaks between them. So in version later, we added parentheses syntax and we changed it to Lasso script. We can lose the square brackets, and we can lose the colons and change things to parentheses. But it's exactly the same code. This is something you can do in BBEdit, just a quick switch. So in Lasso 9, again, I mean, there's a few differences. We don't need to put quotes around the array, or around my array in the variable name anymore. We can iterate. Well, this is something I like to point out. Just like we've had this as a feature request for iterate for a long time. Is why do you need to specify a variable for the value? You know, when you have a loop count. So anyway, so we've added loop value, and if you iterate through a map, you get loop key and loop value. And so we're actually, like, among our features, among the many features of Lasso 9, we do have a list of just kind of general feature requests for the language that we're trying to put in there as well. So that's a nice change. So then, I'm going to talk more about this later, but Lasso 9, rather than doing iterate with the closing iterate tag, we can do a different way of specifying a container using curly brackets. And it's exactly the same code, but rather than doing /iterate, we just do a closing curly bracket. And I'll explain, I have more examples of this syntax. And then if we, Lasso 9 adds some more flexibility. We can do a query expression. This is conceptually the same as an iterate, but with temp in my array do, that defines a local variable temp and executes the code block repeatedly.
Could you go back to the other slide?
Yeah. So I mean, these three do essentially the same thing. All this code has basically the same output with some slight difference.
Another example was better. This is harder to read.
Yeah, well, and I was gonna, I'm not talking much about query expressions today, but where this gets powerful is with temp in my array, where temp begins with a do. You can add where clauses, you can add sort clauses. So it's a little like a SQL statement. You can actually add additional logic, and that's where the power, with this simple example, I mean, the power isn't really apparent. But I wanted to concentrate on defining tags, so this would be another talk. But, which we had more of last year. But, Anyway, but then what I like to point out is this is perfectly fine Lasso 9 syntax. This works great. There's really nothing non-native about this. And in the end, this code runs, just as fast as most of those other examples. So we talk about new syntax, but to a large extent, the things that you're familiar with about Lasso, it's like we're really not deprecating. It's like the if tag looks exactly the same in Lasso 9 as it looks in Lasso 5. So let's see. So I'm going to talk about containers. I just reused the helicopter. It's really cool. Container, you'll see it throughout but yeah. So containers work the same in Lasso 9. This iterate. There's a little difference here. We have the loop value addition, but this basically, conceptually, this is the same as a container that you're used to. Yeah, I changed this slide. This slide shows a little messed up, but I keep seeing little typos in it. But I changed this quite a bit from what I was originally talking about. So you see some of the headers are messed up. Anyway, but Lasso processes the container. This is what Lasso does when it sees a container. It finds the opening container tag. It finds the closing container tag, right? And then the code in between, it doesn't want to actually execute that. It collects all that code. It compiles it and sets it aside. And then it starts working through the array. And for the first item in the array, it executes the code. For the second item in the array, it executes the code. And then it collects all the output together, assembles it into a string, and that's the result of the container. So, it's actually there's quite a bit of work going on just for a simple while loop or an iterate. So in Lasso 9, just kind of conceptually, we can structure that code a very different way. So here we have an iterate. It's going to go through my array, and it's going to output the loop value. And so when we see the curly brackets, that's a code block. And what a code block is, that's code we don't want to execute right now. We want Lasso to compile it and set it aside. We're going to execute it later. So conceptually, that's the same as the code between a beginning and an beginning and a closing of a container. And the carets mean that we want to collect the output. So again, it's like conceptually, that's the same as a container. We're going to collect all the output. And then we want to send that code to the iterate tag, which actually does the work of stepping through the array and executing the code for each element, taking the output, and returning it. So that's what the arrow means. The equal greater than symbol means it's like take the thing on the left and pass it to, or take the thing on the right, sorry, pass the thing on the left. So conceptually, it's like this construct. It's a little unusual, but that's because Lasso's container tags are a little unusual. And so we created this construct as a low-level way of representing what container tags do. And you can specify it this way. You can specify it as a container tag. In the final result you get, both in terms of the string that's output to the web page and in terms of the code that's generated internally, is the same. It's like this is what Lasso's doing internally when it processes a container tag. So in Lasso 9, we've taken that internal, which happens in Lasso 8.5 and C, we've pulled that out into Lasso itself. And so now you're able to write using a container tag, which is a little high level, where you can drop down a level to this kind of lower level. So I just have a description of how that works. The code block is executable. I just basically walked through this. So that's executed for each element in the array. We return the concat. So here, yeah, I just show the two, the iterate. You can see how the elements correspond. The opening tag is the same in both cases. The closing tag exists solely to identify the end of the code block in the upper example. In the lower example, that code block has been kind of explicitly specified using the